Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
I knew something was off the moment I stepped into that beige-walled conference room and saw two chairs instead of one. When your calendar says Strategy Alignment Review and you find HR already seated with a closed manila folder, that isn't a meeting, that's a firing in business casual. Kendall Reese, our newly installed Chief Operating Officer with perfect hair and the personality of a Bluetooth headset, was already flipping through something that didn't need flipping. The man didn't even pretend to look nervous about what was coming, which is almost funny in hindsight because it means he actually thought he could deliver this speech without making it sound like a rehearsed insult. Jack, Kendall said, using the calm HR-approved tone they teach in executive coaching webinars. Thanks for coming in early. I want to first acknowledge how much we appreciate your contributions during this past fiscal year. He nodded like a man who just lied about remembering your birthday. I stared at him without saying a word because I'd been in enough rooms like this to know that when a conversation starts with, I want to acknowledge, it's about to end with, we're moving in another direction. Gloria from HR sat beside him, legs crossed tight, hands folded on that closed folder like it contained the nuclear codes. I knew Gloria. Nice enough lady. Used to laugh at my jokes when we passed in the hallway. Now she couldn't even meet my eyes, probably because they trained her not to lock onto a man right before they take his badge and walk him to the exit like a shoplifter caught pocketing gum. Kendall continued, his voice sliding into that soft, corporate drawl that turns a machete into a scalpel. We're restructuring operations to better align with the evolving pace of the industry. The board and I feel strongly that moving forward, we need to bring in some younger energy, fresh leadership, someone who can scale fast and respond with, digital native agility. That was the moment I realized I was being fired for being too old. Not directly, of course. No one's stupid enough to say that out loud in a building with security cameras, but you'd have to be deaf, blind, and brain-dead not to hear what they were really saying. Younger energy? I had just delivered a 38% profit increase across the division. 38%. That wasn't just a good quarter. That was a buy new chairs for the executive suite kind of quarter. We cut waste, tightened the pipeline, renegotiated 3 key vendor contracts, and rolled out the only automation update that hadn't collapsed under its own complexity. And now they want it faster? I see. I said finally, keeping my voice flat. Not because I wasn't angry, I was furious, but because men like me, after decades in this game, learn that the worst thing you can do when they take the knife out is to flinch. May I ask how soon this is effective? Kendall offered what he must have thought was a sympathetic look, like he was doing me a favor by acting human. End of the week, officially, but if you'd prefer to wrap things today, we understand. We'll of course provide a very generous severance package, along with a glowing letter of recommendation. Gloria finally opened her folder. I caught the top of the first page. Transition plan, Jack Morris. They already had it written up. Probably a month ago. Probably back when I was pulling 14-hour days trying to get the Q2 margin targets in line with our unrealistic projections. I nodded slowly. Then I stood, reached across the table, and shook Kendall's hand. Thank you for your feedback, I said, with the kind of smile that makes people wonder if you're hiding something. Because I was. Because I left a few things untouched. I didn't pack up my things dramatically. I didn't give some speech or throw a chair or storm through the hall shaking my fist at the sky. I simply returned to my desk, collected the small collection of personal effects I'd bothered to keep after 20 years, a framed photo of my wife and daughter at her high school graduation, a stress ball shaped like a burrito, a Montblanc pen I got as a client gift back in 2009, and put them neatly into a cardboard box. Nobody said a word as I left. A few looked up and offered that awkward half-smile people give you when they don't know whether to offer condolences or just pretend they didn't notice you've been tossed out like a worn-down copier. I walked out of that building feeling numb, not defeated, but not triumphant either. Just detached. Like I'd been cut loose from something I spent 2 decades holding together with duct tape and caffeine. But on the drive home, something shifted. I kept thinking about that phrase, younger energy. Like I was a fading battery instead of a guy who'd spent 20 years building a process so stable it practically ran itself. I thought about all the weekends I spent working from hotel rooms instead of being with my family. All the birthdays I missed. All the late nights eating cold takeout under flickering fluorescent lights while some VP in marketing complained about synergy. And I realized something. They didn't just fire me. They used me. They waited until I cleaned up their mess, stabilized the numbers, and built a roadmap even an intern could follow, and then they swapped me out for a shinier face. I wasn't too slow. I was too seasoned, too familiar, too unbrandyable. And they thought I'd just walk away quietly. They thought wrong. What would you do if your boss fired you for being too slow, right after you handed them their biggest profit spike in 5 years? Would you shake their hand and go home like a good soldier? Or would you leave the door open, just wide enough for something to crawl back in? Because me? I left something untouched, and I hadn't even begun to turn the screws. The first week after I got fired was like a low-budget indie film directed by someone who thought existential dread was a plot. I'd wake up too early, out of habit more than purpose, make coffee that tasted vaguely like burnt cardboard, and then stare at my phone like it owed me a better notification than Indeed. 7 new jobs near you. There's nothing like watching recruiters ask for 10 years of experience with software that didn't even exist 5 years ago to make you feel like a relic with a pulse. I tried pretending it was a vacation. I even told my wife, Linda, that I was taking some time to reset and reflect, but really, I was just sitting on the patio with a bottle of mid-shelf bourbon and the same playlist I used to blast in the car on the way to pitch meetings. By day 6, I had submitted my resume to 3 companies I didn't really want to work for and spent roughly 11 hours pretending to optimize my LinkedIn profile, when really I was just rereading old endorsements from people who had long since moved on. Then, one night around 9:30, I got a text from Vince Caldwell, a buddy from finance who still worked at the company, a guy I used to get beers with on Thursdays when work actually ended before 10 p.m. He was one of the few who hadn't gone completely corporate, still signed his emails with a beer emoji, still called BS out loud in meetings. His message was short and to the point. Thought you'd want to see this. New rollout doc. Check slide 17. Attached was a PDF titled Velocity Ops Q3 Strategic Implementation Roadmap. Just the name made me want to throw something. I opened it anyway, scrolling through the front matter where all the usual suspects smiled from glossy headshots and buzzwords piled up like rotting fruit. But when I hit slide 17, I nearly choked on the ice cube in my glass. There it was. My system. My goddamn process. Every step of the model I spent 4 years refining, the inventory throttling algorithm, the supply chain redundancy logic, the real-time vendor scorecards, all laid out like a museum exhibit of someone else's genius. They hadn't even bothered to change the core structure. They just slapped a new color scheme on it, added some circular infographics, and gave it a hip new name like they were selling a protein shake instead of a logistics solution. At the bottom of the slide was the kicker, developed and spearheaded by Ryan Ford, Associate Director of Agile Ops. Ryan Ford. That name alone made me set my glass down harder than I meant to. Ryan was 28 if I remembered right, had a trust fund, a borderline obsession with wearable tech, and once asked me, dead serious, if an invoice number was the same as a purchase order. He was the kind of guy who called brainstorming ideation, thought Slack channels were sacred, and never made it to the office before 10 because he was optimizing his morning cortisol curve. And now this guy, who couldn't read a pivot table without sweating, had taken credit for a system he once called weirdly analog. The final slide was a quote from Kendall Reese, pasted in bold under a picture of him standing with a coffee cup like some TED Talk prophet. Sometimes you need to let go of the old to embrace the agile. That's when the numbness started to wear off, replaced slowly but unmistakably by something else, not just anger, not just resentment, but that deep, slow-burning kind of fury that settles in your bones and makes you remember every night you stayed late fixing problems someone else caused, every birthday you missed because a vendor call ran long, every Monday morning where you were the only one in the building before sunrise, keeping a business running that now pretended you were a speed bump on its road to reinvention. It wasn't just disrespect. It was theft. They didn't just fire me, they whitewashed me out of the story and turned my legacy into a marketing hashtag. Velocity Ops. The sheer smugness of it made my teeth hurt. I called Vince. What the hell am I looking at? I asked. He didn't even pretend not to know. Yeah, man. I saw it and just figured you'd recognize it. They presented it this morning like it was some brand new gospel. Kendall wouldn't shut up about how it's going to redefine vertical responsiveness. Ryan was glowing like he'd just split the atom. Did they even mention where it came from? He hesitated. Not once. And that's when I knew they weren't just trying to move forward without me. They were rewriting history to pretend I was never there to begin with. They were selling my blood, sweat, and spreadsheets as some kids brainstorm, and no one had the guts to say otherwise. Because saying otherwise would mean admitting they'd tossed out the guy who actually made it all work. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the glass. I just stood there in my kitchen, staring out at the dark backyard. I'd spent 2 decades too tired to mow properly, and I made a choice. They could call it Velocity Ops. They could slap new branding on it, let Ryan wear it like a medal, let Kindle parade it in front of investors like some shiny toy. But they didn't know what I'd left behind. They didn't know which pieces they didn't fully understand. And they didn't know, not yet, that systems built by one man always speak his language, even after he's gone. Let them run with it. Let them think it's theirs. Because soon enough, I'd remind them that if you build something wrong, even just one piece, the entire thing can fall in silence. And I knew exactly where to push. It was around 2 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep again, which had become my new normal since the day they told me I was too slow for the pace of modern innovation. There's something about humiliation that lingers under the skin like a sunburn. You don't notice it right away, but every little thing starts to sting. I found myself pacing the house in my slippers, the dog following me like I might be heading somewhere important. I wasn't. But then something strange happened. I walked past the old closet in the hallway where I kept boxes of backup drives, archived projects, and the dusty leftovers of 20 years in logistics operations. I opened one of the boxes, and there it was, the old Node Black install manual. Node Black was a project I'd built back when our systems were held together by duct tape and blind hope. It wasn't sexy, and it never got the spotlight during town halls, but it worked like a charm when everything else broke. Basically, it was a simulation sandbox, a redundancy engine that let you model what would happen if specific operations failed. Think of it like the flight simulator for supply chains. You could unplug a vendor, break a delivery route, shut down a data relay, and watch how it rippled across the network. It wasn't supposed to be a permanent system. It was built for emergency scenarios, war games, basically, and I was the only one who really understood how to run it properly. We never integrated it fully when the IT department got outsourced to that firm in Phoenix, and when they brought in new tools, Node Black was quietly mothballed into the legacy tech graveyard, where nobody dared to delete anything in case it turned out to be important. And that's when I realized I never officially handed over the admin keys. It wasn't some master plan or intentional sabotage. It was just one of those things you forget in the chaos of reorgs and layoffs. When the tech transition happened, I was still managing fire drills and procurement and trying to keep the Q3 numbers from flatlining. So nobody ever pushed me to document Node Black thoroughly. And once they fired me, they assumed, like so many short-sighted managers do, that they could just start fresh without needing the bones of the past. So I booted up my old laptop, the one with the thicker battery that still smelled faintly of airport lounges and stress. I logged in using my original credentials, bracing for a denied access message. But it opened. The interface loaded slower than I remembered, and the resolution looked like something from a bad 90s thriller. But there it was, the dashboard, still live, still wired into the back-end systems that powered real-time vendor chains and fulfillment routes. I stared at the blinking modules and thought, well, look who forgot to lock the cellar. Inside Node Black, I found everything. Live operational schedules for distribution centers, timestamped activity logs, load balancing scripts. There were batch jobs running every few hours that automatically assigned resources based on vendor availability, and sitting in the corner of the script library was one single, untouched file, version queue, legacy override. I'd written that script myself back in 2013. It was meant to be a failsafe, a kind of master interrupt designed to slow everything down in the event of catastrophic failure. I used it once during a system-wide blackout to keep our vendors from burning cache while the primary servers rebooted. After that, I kept it buried in the back end as a last resort tool, and no one else ever touched it because, frankly, no one else understood how it worked. The idea started forming in my mind before I even realized it. Not a full-blown sabotage. I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I wasn't out for revenge with fire and fury. I just wanted to prove a point. They had taken everything I'd built, slapped a hashtag on it, and handed it over to a guy who didn't know the difference between a vendor escalation and a late shipment. They thought they could run my system without me. I wanted to see how far they could really go before it started to creak. But I also knew I couldn't do it alone. So I called my daughter, Sam. Now, Sam is one of those people who always surprises you. She's in her early 30s, freelance UI designer by trade, but with enough tech savvy and side hustle energy to run circles around half the developers I used to manage. We hadn't talked shop in a while. Most of our recent conversations had been about her dog's stomach issues or whether I'd finally gone to the doctor about my shoulder. But when I told her what I'd found, Her voice lit up like I'd handed her a puzzle with a missing corner. "You want to test stress points on a live system they don't know they're still using?" she asked, her tone both amused and concerned. "Dad, that's either brilliant or a felony." "I'm not breaking anything," I said. "I'm just adjusting the balance." So we got to work. She mapped out the UI elements and helped me visualize what areas of the system were still connected to active processes. I focused on the scripting side, testing minor failover paths, tweaking triggers that would slow things down without crashing anything outright. We discovered that several of the new tools Ryan and his team were using were still pinging NodeBlack's backend for routing decisions. They didn't even know it. They were so busy painting a new house, they forgot it was sitting on the old foundation. And that's where the magic lived. Because I wasn't going to tear the whole thing down. I was just going to loosen a few bolts. Let them feel the wobble when something small went wrong. Let them sweat when shipments started arriving a day late. Then with incomplete packing lists that confused their new AI-powered analytics dashboard. Let them scramble to explain why their Velocity Ops engine wasn't operating with velocity anymore. Because sometimes, all it takes is one keyhole left unlocked. And the person who built the door still knows exactly where it squeaks. It started with a misfire, not a crash, not an explosion, nothing dramatic enough to land in headlines. But the kind of slow, spreading chaos that starts small and eats its way into the core. I wasn't looking to cripple anything, not really. I didn't want to take down the whole ship, just rattle the mast enough that the ones steering it realized they weren't in control the way they thought they were. It was a strategic nudge, a quiet whisper into the machine's ear that something wasn't quite right, and that it wasn't going to fix itself just because they slapped a new logo on the hood. The trigger was hidden deep in a vendor synchronization protocol, a line of code designed to delay updates in the event of a critical flag, something I'd built years ago for disaster recovery scenarios. It wasn't malicious. In fact, it was built to protect operations during times of uncertainty. But I recoded it slightly, just enough to delay one key routing confirmation by exactly 18 hours. That's it. 18 hours. Long enough to break the rhythm, not long enough to set off alarms, unless, of course, you'd stripped out the manual oversight protocols in favor of something shinier and more agile. And that's exactly what Ryan Ford and his newly minted Velocity Ops team had done. They'd replaced the oversight systems I'd carefully built with a fancy, overstyled dashboard that looked great in investor meetings but had no real audit trail built into the back end. They had removed all the safety nets in the name of speed. The irony, of course, being that speed without brakes doesn't make you faster, it just makes you reckless. And when the routing confirmation failed to process correctly, the system rebalanced automatically, rerouting a key shipment of high-value electronics meant for a Fortune 100 client through a secondary warehouse in Nevada, a warehouse that didn't have the proper clearance licenses for international export. By the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. The client was expecting delivery by Friday at noon. The shipment arrived the following Tuesday. Half the order was held in customs, and the contract's penalty clause, the one I had personally negotiated to protect us from exactly this kind of delay, triggered an automatic fine of $4.7 million. Within hours, the client's legal team sent notice of breach of terms, and our stock, or rather, their stock now that I was no longer part of the we, started slipping like wet stone. Panic spread fast. Internal audit was called before the end of the day. Emergency calls were scheduled. Kendall and Ryan convened a transparency meeting with stakeholders, where they confidently blamed unexpected legacy software conflicts for the failure. I nearly spit out my coffee when I read the transcript Vince forwarded me later that evening. They actually said, on record, that the issue stemmed from unoptimized back-end processes left behind from a previous architecture. I was the previous architecture. So I pulled out the file. It was a memo dated 6 months before my departure, where I had explicitly warned Kendall and the senior engineering team about the risks of removing certain manual confirmation checkpoints from the logistics chain. It included a detailed explanation of why those safety protocols existed, a breakdown of potential failure scenarios, and a recommendation to retain at least 2 manual fallback scripts in case of vendor misclassification or routing conflict. Kendall had replied with a single sentence, "Let's revisit post-transition, too busy right now." I anonymized the file, scrubbed the metadata, and uploaded it to an anonymous Dropbox link. Then I sent that link to 3 journalists who specialized in corporate transparency and tech accountability, as well as 2 shareholders I knew had been pushing for more oversight since Kendall took over. I didn't include a message. The document spoke for itself. Within 24 hours, the story broke, firing the brakes, how legacy oversight was scrapped for speed. The article wasn't sensational. It didn't need to be. It was meticulous. It walked through the logistics of the failure, cited the exact memo I'd written, and ended with a single devastating quote from an unnamed former senior manager. "We built the system to survive mistakes." They removed the parts they didn't understand. Kindle was called into a private board session that Friday. By Monday, the word resignation was being floated in emails that were getting leaked faster than they could write them. Ryan had already gone quiet, and rumor had it he'd been asked to take an unpaid leave of absence pending further review. The Velocity Ops team was frozen. The board had initiated an external audit. And somewhere deep in a buried server folder, Node Black was blinking steadily, still connected, still operational, still mine. And the best part? I hadn't done anything that violated policy. I hadn't hacked a system. I hadn't falsified data. I hadn't even accessed anything I wasn't originally authorized to use. They were still running my code, using my structure, relying on systems they didn't realize were built to anticipate failure because I had anticipated theirs. The only thing I'd done was leave a keyhole unlocked. And now the locks were changing. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel smug. I felt, still, like a man who had spent 2 decades laying bricks, only to be replaced by someone who thought paint would do the same job, and then watched the whole wall crumble because they didn't think foundation mattered anymore. Let them rebuild. Let them panic. Because speed kills when you don't know the brakes. And I had just reminded them what a real operator looks like, one who understands that a machine isn't fast because it's new. It's fast because it's stable. And stability isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that feels like it might be productive if you don't look too hard at the inbox, when I got the email from someone named Erica Greaves, Chief Communications Officer at the company that had fired me not 3 months prior. Her subject line read Private Board Request, Transitional Guidance, which was their corporate way of saying, "We messed up, and we're hoping you're not too pissed to help us mop it up." I read it once, then again, then let it sit for 3 hours while I went on a walk around the block, trying to decide whether my curiosity outweighed my satisfaction. Eventually, I decided to respond with a simple, neutral message. Happy to meet. I assume this is off book. Let me know when and where. Because if I was going to play the game, I wanted them to know I still understood the rules better than they did. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon, 4 p.m., in a private conference space downtown, not the old office, of course, but one of those neutral sites where executives pretend to be collaborative while secretly wondering how bad the headlines might get. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing the same navy blazer they'd all seen a dozen times before, except this time it wasn't wrinkled from a long week of overtime or dulled by fluorescent lighting. This time, I looked sharp because I felt sharp, like a man who finally stopped carrying weight that was never his to bear. Kindle wasn't there, naturally. He had resigned the previous week, effective immediately, which in corporate speak means he was pushed out with just enough cushion to keep his reputation from bleeding all over the quarterly report. Ryan Ford was also absent, though word had gotten around that he'd been quietly reassigned to internal research, another euphemism, this one for exile, with a title. Around the table were 6 people, most of whom I'd known for years, board members, legal counsel, one external advisor who looked like he'd been pulled in at the last minute to lend credibility. Erica opened the meeting with a warm smile and enough fake sincerity to frost a sheet cake. "Jack, we just want to say how deeply we regret the way things unfolded. Your contributions were never in question, and frankly, in light of recent developments, the board feels your strategic oversight was undervalued." Undervalued. That was a hell of a word for, we fired you because we thought we could do better with someone younger, dumber, and full of buzzwords. She went on to explain that the company was undergoing a transitional restructuring, which sounded like they were hoping I'd come back long enough to plug the holes until they could find another Kindle with a tighter jawline and a shorter memory. They offered me a consulting contract, a public acknowledgement in the next shareholder letter, and what they called creative control over operational rehab strategy, which meant I'd get to fix what they broke, under the watchful eye of the people who broke it. I listened. I nodded. And when they were done, I opened the manila folder I'd brought with me and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a simple document, a revenue forecast that I had generated using their own metrics, cross-referenced against the timeline of the changes they'd made after firing me. In bold at the top was the projected drop, 17.2% over the next 2 quarters, assuming no new operational delays and no further vendor fallout. I looked directly at Erica, then at the rest of the room, and said, calmly and clearly, "You don't need a consultant. You need a conscience." The silence that followed was thick enough to chill. "I didn't build your systems to be trendy," I continued. "I built them to last. You broke them chasing a narrative. And now you want the same hands that built the foundation to clean up the rubble, except this time with no authority, no say, and no real trust. I'm not interested in helping you pretend this is fixable by tweaking some charts and putting my name on a press release." One of the board members, Saul Jerson, an old-school finance guy with the emotional range of drywall, tried to cut in with something about mutual benefit, but I held up a hand. "I'm not angry anymore," I told them, "but I'm also not coming back." And then I stood, buttoned my blazer, and walked out. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt ready. By the following Monday, I had incorporated a new business, a small, no-frills consulting agency focused on mid-sized companies struggling with overpaid executives and under-engineered systems. I named it Ironback Strategies, a little nod to what it takes to carry weight in silence and still walk tall. My first 3 clients were competitors of the company that fired me. One of them used to lose bids to us because we were faster. Now they were calling me to find out how to stabilize after inheriting our disgruntled clients. Sam came on as my lead systems architect. I brought in 2 former ops analysts who left the company when things started going south. We didn't advertise. We didn't post on LinkedIn. We just worked quietly, effectively, and with a clarity that comes from knowing you've already lived through the fire and came out carrying blueprints. The company that fired me? Still recovering. They limped through another 2 quarters, made some PR moves, cycled through 2 interim COOs, and eventually sold off a piece of the business to a holding firm that specializes in turning bloated tech into leaner, uglier profit machines. I watched from a distance. Not with glee. Not with bitterness. Just with peace. Because there's a difference between burning a bridge and walking away before it collapses. I didn't torch the past. I just stopped trying to fix it. And sometimes, that's the smartest move a man can make.